Blessings, y'all. Man, this is another episode of the Still Growing podcast. And this time, I want to talk about why I can't stop trying to save us, right? This is actually going to be a dedication to my cousin who passed last year around this time. Shouts out to Tyrell. And I really wanted to be intentional about honoring him while also telling a very important story about the work that I do, but also how the work that I do is only possible because of the sacrifices that I've made, right? Things that I've had my whole life, things that I've identified myself with and found value in who I was. And I'm sure all of you all can relate to this. It's family. Family is the thing that makes everybody human, no matter what we pray to, what our orientation is, what background we come from, what experiences we have. We're all a part of a family. And I want to talk about how being an artist, being in spaces that help highlight culture can also rob us of that humanity. And sometimes we disassociate from our real lives in order to show up in this performative way in community and in culture. And what I talk about is dedicated to Black people, but it's not limited to that. I heard something the other day that was like, if we raise the quality of Black people's lives, we also in turn raise the quality of everybody else's lives in America. Because oftentimes, because of the way we've been conditioned, a lot of our people feel like they're alienating or excluding other groups of people when they are pro-Black or invested in the outcome of their people initially. But I can assure you that for every Black woman who maternal rates are being examined and mortality rates of those maternal experiences, aka there's a lot of women not making it out of birth, right? A lot of women are not being able to birth their children adequately, raise them adequately. That helps all other mothers of other groups of ethnicities, backgrounds, improve the quality of their children's lives. When we confront incarceration and the over-policing of Black men, we also increase the environment for other groups of men of color, even white men, to be justified and given due process in our judicial system. So I just wanted to say that because I'm very comfortable and I'm very purposeful about the work that I do, but I know it can oftentimes make a lot of people uncomfortable, and I'm very aware of why, right? But I continue to try to save us just because I've lost some of the most important people in my life, and I haven't gotten to experience some of the most important people in my life because of the choices that I've made, as far as deciding to come to Philadelphia and pursue what I knew was the greater work that the Most High was calling me to, and what the universe was conspiring in my best interest. That's taken me away from my nieces and nephews. That's taken me away from my aunts and uncles. That's taken me away from my cousins and my sisters and my parents. So, I know a lot of people think that I'm just out here in Philadelphia doing whatever I want or being selfish. And I say a lot of people because I'm talking about the people who matter to me the most. So if they do ever hear this, which I hope they do, I want you all to know that I came out here to understand what Black people were going through because I wanted to improve the quality of the lives of our family. I didn't want to just sit in my ivory tower, sit in my benefits, sit in my accomplishments, sit in my success with a prepackaged life and not be an asset to anyone but myself or who is directly connected to me. I wanted to be able to change the experience of people who are Black so that we didn't have to go back, right? Same thing that very important leaders have done all throughout the time we've been here in America. So I apologize if this becomes a heavier episode, but it's important. It's important we have the heavy episodes too. You know what I mean? And I'm actually very, very inspired and motivated, even considering that my cousin was murdered. It's like it reminded me that I have to be very intentional and very purposeful with every day of my life. And so I honor him by playing some of his music when this day comes around, because I know deep down inside he wanted to be a healer and he wanted to be a messenger. And so I'm continuing to carry on his legendary legacy, right? So shouts out to Tyrell, shouts out to Puerto Reefa, shouts out to my little cousin, man. The only real brother by blood that I ever really had. So, I want to continue by, centering this around what we're doing here, which is independent media, right? I started this Substack because I was tired of putting all of my best work on social media all the time and not being able to sustain myself on a day-to-day level, on a day-to-day basis. Because back when I used to be in the streets, let me tell you, we used to be having way more money than this. And being legitimate, like I was talking about in one of my last episodes, has been the hardest road that I've actually been on, because I'm prioritizing my woman's safety, my family's safety, my friends' safety, their comfort, their sense of stability. I'm not just prioritizing my own when I'm out here, or as I used to be in the streets, I should say. When I'm doing this legitimately, it's because I want to be able to do something that they can all inherit and hold on to. So, sometimes we watch people in our lives, and I'm speaking about someone in particular that I met in Philadelphia. I'm using this as an example, but this is a symbol for a lot of things that I've seen in my life. A lot of things in my life, man. I've always tried to save people, especially from substance abuse and, you know, financial instability, and even sometimes just flat out abuse, right? So, whether some of my friends have disappeared through the system, whether some of my families have disappeared through courtrooms and poverty, sometimes I've even watched them disappear from this planet. The hardest part isn't that they disappeared, it's the fact that they're gone. And we still treat their pain like a product, like something that can be taken for granted, right? Two different things: a product and also something to be taken for granted, right? I want to talk a little bit more specifically about art and music, because that's what my profession, my study, and my experiences professionally have been in, right? A lot of the pain that my cousin and even included myself experienced in our life was molded into a aesthetic for being a black man in America. The hip hop, the drug dealing, the violence, the gang life. It's like we were really just encompassing those things because we were disenfranchised. So let's break that down a little bit, right? Where there are standards, morals, values that people pass on, create traditions out of, to ensure that the people who they bring into this world and the people who are inside of their world are taken care of. And whether that's a stable family, whether that's retirement plans, whether that's stocks, whether that's a home, whether that's a business, anything that can help insulate us from the racism and the white supremacy of this world. Us as black boys, we were born into the streets. We were born into poverty, and we had to figure out what to do. And little did me or my cousin know at the time, and a lot of other young black men, that, you know, drugs were put into our community so that we could be incarcerated or falsely accused for crimes that we didn't do, or crimes that we did do but were only crimes because they were criminalizing young black men, and that other groups of people didn't suffer from this as much, right? And one thing that I attribute this to, that I talk about in my work a lot, is, there was a blueprint to this moral, traditional fuck up that we inherited, right? I call it a moral fuck up because, as I used to run around in the streets, you know, there's this thing that they call today, it's called black excellence, right? So I used to run around in the streets, but trust me and believe me, I came from a more affluent family initially before they got divorced, and I was supposed to be on the fast track to this so-called black excellence of today. I was supposed to go to school, go to the military, get a little bit of money, insulate myself from blackness, get a FHA loan, and just live the military lifestyle. One thing that my parents taught me before anybody else in being American and being black and American was like, don't look ghetto. You don't want to look like you're from the hood, and you have to work half as You gotta work twice as much to get half as much, right? The being from the hood thing was not my choice, right? The looking ghetto part was an aesthetic that I just mentioned earlier from what the culture that we were advertised and promoted to in the media that we did not control. And working twice as hard to get half as much just is, I truly believe, a sin against oneself to know that you're being a part of something that is meant to destroy you, but you still participate in it. And then you introduce your children to it and tell them to inherit it as well. So as I was, doing good grades at school, I was leaving the house so that I could play gangster, play street guy, because I had to be vigilant in my environment because people would steal my video games, come to my house, break in it, fight me at the bus stop. You know what I'm saying? Like, there were so many different things I could not avoid on a day-to-day basis just on the commute to school, let alone being at home alone because my dad was a single parent. There wasn't but so much I could insulate myself from. And by the time I grew a little bit older, I remember, especially like driving around in my car, remembering like the music I used to listen to, like the music I used to listen to as a real young adult, but honestly still a child, with some super duper dark music. Like, I would listen to things like DMX, if y'all know, It's Dark and Hell is Hot, right? That whole album is pretty much about his battle with the devil internally, and trying to stay on the right path with God. And it's just over some really hard beats, right? Shouts out to Swiss Beats. And that was like the thin line between homicide and suicide, right? Being in your environment, whether you were gonna choose to be a victim of it or if you were gonna choose to be vigilant enough to survive in it and overcome it. And that eventually could result in you catching a homicide, or I don't know if there's anything worse, but that's typically how people frame it, that you'll go to jail or be killed. I guess that might be worse, right? But not too much on the language, right? So by the time I was in 12th grade, I was kicked out of school because I had caught a triple felony for something that I was falsely accused of, but that I was certainly at the time allegedly done, right? In their eyes, in the court's eyes, they had no evidence, but they were surely willing to proceed with charging me with those crimes without that evidence, because they were very sure that I did it, right? Even though I had people who cooperated in lying, right, and saying that it was me who committed the crime that they caught, when in terms it was them. So it was really unfortunate, right? Because I can't even just call it snitching. Snitching is when somebody tells on you for something that you did do. But I was basically framed in hindsight because it was actually what they did. And because I was black and an easy target, they framed it as if it was me. And they weren't black. So the police were willing to help them make that story be the story that was presented in court. And I'm explaining this in such great detail because even after I got out of that situation, I still continued to catch more cases and get in more trouble. But I want to take a step back and explain, how does someone even get there, right? How do you become a drug dealer with a triple felony charge, right? Thank God I wasn't convicted for that, because, man, I probably wouldn't be here doing this right now. But my dad used to go to work, or at least prepare for work, from 6 a.m. and wouldn't get home till 6 p.m. And, based on most people's perception of him, he was the lucky guy, right? He was a working class man. He worked less than a mile away from he worked at less than a mile away from where we lived. And, the majority of people who lived in my neighborhood were raised by single mothers, and they didn't have the level of access to resources and a workable living wage like he did. So by the time he had walked through the door at 6:30, my dad was exhausted, and he still was taking care of me, right? Cooking, doing the laundry, and etc. And both my parents were fighting their own wars with alcohol at the time. So they weren't ultimately as present as one would like. So that's how I ended up in the streets initially, just looking for attention, looking for affection, looking for some type of reward system, acknowledgement, respect. Um, I mean, even just presence. Some days I just wanted to be in somebody's presence. And because, my sisters had moved away and my parents weren't always present, that's how I ended up in the streets. But not immediately selling drugs, just hanging out late, quote unquote being bad. And then once you're exposed to what's going on out there, it starts to mold you. You spend your birthdays with some of these people. You see people get beat up. You see people get jumped. You see people get robbed. You see people conspire to do all of these things to other people. And you realize that if you're not prepared, that you'll be a victim of these things too. Eventually I was. People robbed my house once they saw me getting off the bus and seeing me going home. They'd take my keys. I mean, I've been through enough to make me want to respond and not just take it. I remember one day I came home from school and I told my dad that people were picking on me and that the teacher essentially wanted me to just behave even when I was being bullied. And I told my dad that I wasn't going to stand for it anymore and that I wanted to do something about it. And I encouraged fighting. And my dad said that I should let people bully me in order for me to get my education because he doesn't want me to get suspended. So if somebody were to start bullying me, that I should just continually tell. That I should tell until some type of action was taken. And I felt like it didn't have the amount of dignity that I wanted to live with and walk through school. This was probably about 6th or 7th grade, so I wasn't prepared to live with that reputation for the rest of my school career. So once I was introduced to more of the streets and the codes that come with it, right? The afternoons with my friends and sirens is in the distance, the build up of just like street arguments and conflicts. One day, I got caught up in the situation I mentioned earlier with that non-black friend, and that's where things started to really go downhill. For the next 6 years, I was on probation or on some type of supervision constantly, and that's when I realized that there were two worlds I had been navigating, right? The broken nuclear family and the raw reality of street life and poverty. And I saw the duplicity. I saw how the hood was commercialized. I saw how the working class life was commercialized on TV in both aspects, one demeaning and degrading another. Working class people saying that people in the streets are criminals, and people in the streets saying that people who went to work were corny because of how much they made. And so I was stuck in the middle oftentimes because I was exposed to both, and most of the people I knew were only well versed in one or the other. So by the time I become an artist, my idea was to like talk about this duplicity and this dynamic that existed in my life, but I see in the day-to-day commentary and interest of most black people, whether they're in the church, whether they're in the arts and crafts and culture spaces, whether they're in the government, whether they're working every day. I see working people ride around to street music all day only to then criticize people in the streets later. I watch people who sell drugs all day want to participate in day-to-day civilian activity as if they weren't just breaking the law, right? And after I left Newports and Newport News, I went to Philadelphia and I started a commercial space called Newports and News in honor of where I was from. Most people think it's about cigarettes, right? So I have to always clarify that. And when I created Newports and News, I invited a lot of the creative people I had met in Philadelphia from 2017 up until then, which was 2019. So it had been about 18 months. I'd been living in Philadelphia, and one person I had met was Knowledge. And, I invited Knowledge to my house. I watched him perform. He was friends with a lot of my friends. He was truly like a brilliant rapper. Like he could freestyle about anything for 10 minutes straight. And so I interviewed him. I got his story. And one thing that I recognized about him early on was that he was very, very confident with his craft. But when it came to just communicating and sharing his own story, he was a bit antisocial. He wasn't very eager to just talk. And I found that interesting for somebody who could literally rap for 15 minutes straight without a hiccup, man. And so I gave him a headline opportunity to perform at our venue. I had paid him some money, and I continued to see him grow within the community, a so-called community that I was in Philadelphia for artists. But then one day, I started seeing some of the hardships of his own life start to catch up. There was a significant moment at that showcase that I had done for him where I learned a lot about him in one evening, where his dad randomly showed up. And I say randomly because apparently, from what I understood and he told me, his dad wasn't in his life consistently. But somehow he heard about the show and he made an appearance. And I have a video that I share in one of my Substack writings called Why I Keep Trying to Save Us, where you can literally go watch a 45-minute video of him and his dad and about 4 other people having a conversation in the backyard of my venue just about things that are going on in the Black community. And I feel like that was like a legendary interview session just because, like, this man hadn't talked to his dad in a long time, and they were in the middle of talking about community, which says a lot about, even as a father who was absent, he's still observant and alive about what's going on in the community. And a son who hadn't been fathered had his own point of views. And then there were several people, including my friend Sean at the time. I mean, he's still my friend, so, but at the time he was there, and all of these different Black men had a different lived experience in the same community, but they were all broken by the same thing, which was family abandonment in the streets in some kind of capacity. So I went home, and, you know, I never really looked back at that moment until recently, this year. Um, and today's May 19th. I probably saw Knowledge about a month and a half ago. So that was probably March. And I saw him in the subway completely strung out on opioids. Um, he's not even 27 years old. When I met him, he was probably 17, if not maybe 18 at the most. And it threw me off. I'm not gonna lie, because people had told me that he was going through something. I had, like I said, I had witnessed him on social media and just in the community of people that we knew lose a couple friends and a girlfriend, but I didn't think he had fallen to rock bottom like this. And so he apparently had been on drugs for over 4 or 5 years now, and he hasn't recovered. He hasn't been to rehab. His family, which he initially didn't really have. His mother apparently wasn't very present in his life beyond what she was capable of, and also sure did the best that she could in keeping him clean and providing him an outlet. So when I went home that day, and I started making phone calls to see like if anybody had witnessed this, and one thing I was able to recognize very quickly was that even for the people who had, they haven't been exposed to this. They haven't been um, experienced in dealing with anybody with this level of trauma or um, addiction. So for them, it was almost a self-preservating interest to stay away from him. They wanted to stay away from him because they didn't want him to follow them home. They didn't know what he was capable of. They didn't know what he was all in his mind. And I felt like I had failed him. And that was what prompted me to write this, was because I had built Newports anew so that these things wouldn't happen. And even though I tried to give him as much as I had at the time, it wasn't enough. And even as I'm saying this now, I still kind of carry that weight, even though I know it's not my fault and wasn't my responsibility. It just always makes me beg the question, like, when does this stop? And if it ever will stop. At this point in my life, I've come to terms and I'm prepared for it not to. Just simply because if it was of an interest to people as much as it is to me, then there'd be more of a cooperative effort. But oftentimes I see a lot of my own people benefit from this or regard themselves highly because they have something to compare themselves to, someone that's poor, someone who's addicted, someone who's, you know, just disenfranchised in our community. It validates why you have a job. It validates why you went to school. It validates what treatment you might accept outside of our community in predominantly white spaces in order to have a roof over your head. So I realize a necessary evil that poverty plays in a capitalistic society. It ensures that you can always look lower than yourself socially to keep yourself motivated and conditioned to basically spend all of your work money on rent and groceries and have a day or two to yourself to rest and eat some DoorDash and see the poor people on the street and say, at least I'm not them. At least I'm not homeless. At least I'm not debilitated, disabled, disenfranchised. At least I'm not them. And so, one thing that I'll say, including everything I've said, is one thing I want to highlight is subscribing to this is important simply because there's no one else who's going to support me, right? As of 32 years, obviously things change. There's always more to come, but it's going to be very unlikely that I get sponsors for things like this. So it's very important that the people who are listening to this and want to continue hearing voices like mine or just see me live in this world without having to lose dignity or respect, not only for myself, but from my peers, and receive disrespect from people who don't want to see me live or thrive anyway. And that's why it's important for me to acknowledge and exonerate the life of my cousin, because he was innocent and those streets molded him because he had nowhere to go. And he was one of the most kindest people I've ever known. I remember playing the video game with him and him being so meek and so lovable and so tender. And when I experienced him as an adult man with a child living in Atlanta, it was like I had seen in his eyes the innocence that the world had stripped from him and removed from him. Some of the stories he had to tell me in our intimate moments really made me realize what we had become, and that our parents didn't raise us this way, that they tried their best, but even our parents were, trying their best to survive in this world and navigate it and learn who they were. So I genuinely know for a fact, and I believe in my heart, that my cousin is still rooting for me. And I know he is. He understood each other on a level that nobody else understood each other. He knew why I was out here, and he knew why I was out there in the streets. He knows why I'm out here in Philadelphia. He knows why I was out there in them streets. It was the same thing he was trying to escape. It was the pain of losing your family, the vigilance you had to have to live in them streets. It was the intellect that we built into ourselves, because without it, we wouldn't have survived either environment. It was the antisocial behavior that we grew accustomed to because we didn't have anyone to talk to or anywhere to go and anybody who understood us. So I really do appreciate everybody who's listening to this episode. And, I do want to always send my condolences to my own family, because I know it may not look like I'm as invested as some would believe or like. But if I don't say this anywhere else, I'll say it today. There's been fractures in our community and in our families for so long that, the days that we reminisce on and we hold nostalgia for are long gone. They're gone. And even though we have family traditions and values, they're not as strong as the pressures of this world is. So I'll continue on with my point, because after that father-son reunion at my space, and after seeing knowledge in that condition, I wanted to ask people these questions. I created some questions, and I'll even put a link in the description somewhere, to the old article if you want to go back and just see more of the context of this. I'm actually synthesizing a lot of the commentary from that in the topics of today, just so that we can make meaningful time of this episode. But these are some questions I will ask you if you don't want to go read the article. These were some questions from the article, right? How do you feel about people addicted to drugs in your city, right? Is it empathy or is it a speed walk past kind of vibe, right? Right. So number 2, how do you feel about a criminal justice system that commodifies a 12th grader's mistakes, right? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that our justice system tries to capitalize on young men and women every single day, and that some of our family members work there for a salary? Number three, would you still make art if it was illegal? See, that's something that that question was really important to me because, marijuana is literally legalized now. And so many men like me's lives have been totally ruined by just being incarcerated or charged or, you know, being a part of the illegal drug trade, so called, for marijuana. So if singing songs was illegal, how would that make you feel? Would you still make art? If painting was illegal, if making visual paintings was illegal, would you still do it? Or would you just accept that it was illegal? Number four, is there anyone in your life you left behind because it was simply convenient not to help them? Right? Plain and simple. I feel like if you're honest with yourself, it's more important that you take this time to just acknowledge that you did it. Because I'm sure we all have. And I'm sure if you aren't the person who's done it, you're more than likely the person it happened to. Right? And on the flip side, have you ever abandoned someone who was truly trying to pull you out of the fire? Because sometimes we're guilty of that as well, where we aren't on the best path and someone's trying to help us, but we ignore the help, right? So, without any further ado, I want to take this time to thank the people who are paying and are supporting this Substack, because without you all, I probably would have gotten off of this platform and gave up, just due to the fact that I have to choose to be very intentional about, or at least my efforts, as I've clearly been stating and mentioning here today. So, first and foremost, we want to thank Miss Michelle from Canvas. We want to thank Miss EJ, which is Miss Sharon's mom. These are our yearly paid subscribers. We also want to thank Miss Yatina. We want to thank Dom, One Random Nine. We want to thank Yasmin. We want to thank my mother for subscribing. Shouts out to mom. And A Blazer. I don't know who A Blazer is. I hope that they're listening to these and that they're catching these, because I would love to connect with you more. And further than that, I'd also like to mention, thank you to Knowledge for all the time that he provided to my platform and the lived experience that we have. And, I always want you to know that whether you hear this never or later, that somewhere in the energies of the universe that you know that I'm always rooting for you and advocating for you, just like anybody else who's been in my life, who's doing the best that they can. We're not all lucky, man. We're not all going to be black excellence, and we shouldn't have to be black excellence to be able to be human and to be able to be safe. And, on top of that, I'm very grateful for the opportunities that I've, had and the accomplishments that I've made of them. So, I also want to add, and this is the last part, we have Strategy Sundays. Each Sunday, I ask my chat a question. So please join the chat so that we can have more conversations and build more strategy on how to prevent things like this, and also make more of an impact in our own lives together. So without any further ado, this is Still Growing Podcast. I'll see y'all soon, man.